Hi, thanks for joining me again today. We're continuing our discussion on the Fourth Amendment, and last time I was talking about reasonable suspicion. And what is reasonable suspicion? We got on the topic of Terry stops or the stop and frisks, and I told you that the officer needs a reasonable suspicion to believe that somebody is armed and dangerous in order to do that kind of a pat down of the outer layer of clothing. And again, that's something that we see all the time. You know, if you watch any kind of law enforcement uh, show on TV, like Cops or something like that, just about every single time somebody is being investigated for a crime, the police officer generally pats them down. It's not appropriate in all situations, but it is a very common practice. And what the Supreme Court was really doing in deciding whether or not the police officers should be allowed to pat people down is they were weighing the government interest against the private interest. And the government interest there is safety. And then what is the intrusion against the individual, patting down the outer layer of clothing? The Supreme Court was thinking, well, that's not such a bad intrusion. The safety of the police officers certainly outweighs that. And you may disagree or agree with that, but that's generally the logic that the Supreme Court comes at some of these issues with, is balancing. But I wanted to, now that we have a little bit of an introduction into reasonable suspicion, I want to talk about detentions and what the difference between a consensual encounter versus a detention is. So if a police officer comes up to you and says, "Hey, can I talk to you?" If you said no and walked away, the police officer might do one of two things: either let you go or say, "Nope, you have to stay right here." If the police officer lets you go, then clearly that was a consensual encounter. If the police officer says, "Nope, you have to stay," clearly you're being detained for some reason. A common thing to do in that situation would be the officer says, "Hey, can you come here and talk to me? Am I being detained?" is the question that a lot of people would ask. And it's a smart question because then the officer has to make a decision. Is this a detention or is this a consensual encounter? If the officer says no, you're free to go. If the officer says yes, then you're being detained. And a detention requires reasonable suspicion. So again, reasonable suspicion exists when when an officer has specific and articulable facts to believe that criminal activity is afoot. So what that means is that the officer has to have some kind of an articulable fact as to why you should be investigated for a crime. Courts have looked at a ton of cases to determine whether encounter with police was a consensual encounter or a detention. And what they're really looking for is they're looking for different kinds of factors that would lead a reasonable person to believe that they were not free to go when they were interacting with law enforcement, right? If you're free to go, it's a consensual encounter. But if it's a situation where the person does not feel free to go, then we're talking about a detention, and that requires reasonable suspicion. So a couple examples. If a police officer is in a police car and then they roll up behind you, whether you're in a car or walking out on the street, and then they turn on their lights and sirens and they put their headlight on you, their spotlight on you, the courts have looked at that as a detention, where a reasonable person, when they have a police officer in a police car roll up behind them with their lights and sirens and spotlight on you, nobody would feel free to go in that situation. So there's case law that shows or has decided that that kind of a situation is a detention. Another situation where a reasonable person would not feel like they were free to go, and courts have decided that it is a detention, is if a police officer tells you that they suspect you of a crime. If a police officer walks up to somebody in an airport or even out on the sidewalk and says, we think that we have information to believe that you're selling drugs. And maybe that's true, maybe that's not true, right? We don't know what information the police officer has, but if somebody's being investigated for a crime, they certainly wouldn't feel free to go, and that would make it a detention. Another example would be a situation where somebody's out walking on the street and then a police officer says, "Hey, come over here." In that situation, the officer, it's clearly not a consensual encounter, because in a consensual encounter, you're free to go. But when an officer says, "Come over here," they're restricting your movements. They're forcing you to come to them. It's not like the officer walks up to you and is trying to start a conversation. The officer is giving you an order. And in that situation, a reasonable person would not feel free to leave when an officer is giving them an order to come here. That's essentially an order to stay. So in all of those situations, the police officer would have to have reasonable suspicion. And again, reasonable suspicion. They need specific and articulable facts to believe that criminal activity is afoot. It's a low standard as far as what we have in the criminal law goes. But I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something from it. We've talked a lot about the Fourth Amendment as far as what is a search or what is not a search, and now we're starting to focus on some of the more nuanced points and how the government uses different standards, different legal doctrines to go through that Fourth Amendment protection, right? So in this situation, reasonable suspicion would allow a police officer to stop you and essentially seize you momentarily so that they can investigate whether or not a crime is going on. And we'll move up this ladder. Right now we're talking about reasonable suspicion. We'll move on to probable cause. We'll move on to the warrant requirements. And so, we're taking baby steps along the way. I hope you stick around for future videos because I think you'll learn something from it. So again, thank you for joining me. If you have any questions about what I'm talking about, please consult an attorney. And I hope to see you next time. Thank you.